It's a mean age. But it is gonna be a beautiful future as long as we don't fuck it up. I'm Brian McWilliams, and this is Mean Age Daydream, where I bring you unfiltered comedy, criticism, philosophy, and politics with a Mean Age Daydream. Hello, my lovelies. Welcome to Mean Age Daydream. I am, of course, Brian McWilliams, here with you once again, even though I am a little under the weather. You know, caught another cold, yet another cold. And the way I look at it is, if you're not partying hard enough, you don't catch that many colds. You party hardy, you get sick. And I'm partying hardy. So anyway, I'm here. And I feel okay, though. It shouldn't impact my ability to think, speak, act, nor sneak behind my wife's back and eat all the chocolates that I hide in the cupboard from the kitties. Anyway, we're here. I want to remind you guys that you can support our show by going to patreon.com/Lions of Liberty and get bonus content, including my daily rants. Or if you're on Locals, you can support us on Locals at lionsofliberty.locals.com. So please head over and do that. Or just subscribe. Share the show. Also great. So let's get into it today. First things first. It's been interesting to see that the 80s era of rock stars have started to come out and, I guess, find a little bit more of a rational place when it comes to the trans debate. Now, last week on the show, if you listened, you had heard I walked through some of the arguments that I think can be made for the trans population to thrive a bit more under an anarchical system, a libertarian system. Now, that is not to be confused my endorsing their benefit under that system, because I have no issue, nor have I ever had an issue with adults transitioning and doing whatever they want with their bodies. I don't give a shit what you do. I don't care what you want to do to yourself. I don't care if you want to add on 3 different dicks. I don't care if you want no dicks. It doesn't matter. As long as it doesn't impact my life, my ability to live, my ability to be free, and my liberties and those of my family members, I really don't care what you do. And I want you to thrive, and I want you to be happy. Thus, my episode talking about the benefits that would exist under anarchism. However, that does not mean that I am on board with this new orthodoxy that's being forced down everybody's throats by trans activists, an unbelievably tiny portion, even within the trans movement, the trans activists, but a highly vocal, a highly aggressive, and for some odd reason, a highly potent group that the media seems to kowtow to, as do politicians. Now, there have been some interesting developments in regards to this. I discussed the Missouri bill, which I'm not a fan of in regards to trans issues, but some of the conversations around this have now become a little bit more culturally politicized, or actually, I should say culturally discussed, because you've got 80s rockers like Dee Snider, who has been forever, by the way, and I will say forever, a very outspoken advocate for the gay community, for transgender rights, for all of these things. Really, he's as far left as you can go, you know, and I guess considering the fact that he was a cross-dressing rock star who dressed up as a lady and all the makeup and all that in the glam era, well, it's not too surprising that he would be on board with that. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But the San Francisco Pride Parade just kicked him out of being, I think he was there, I don't know, not MC, but Grand Marshal, you know, this honorary position. And they were going to use his rock and roll anthem, "We're Not Gonna Take It." Well, which also, what are they not taking anymore? People are bending over backwards for trans rights right now. So I don't know what they're not taking. They're not taking anybody's feelings into account if you're a female athlete or a female that wants to dress in privacy without a man in your dressing room. I guess that's what they're not taking. They're not going to take that anymore. They're not going to take anyone's feelings into account anymore, nor your basic right to privacy. But I digress. So Dee Snider responded to Paul Stanley, who is another 80s rocker, right? Kiss, the band Kiss, who many people think is a great band. I think they suck shit. But whatever. You're feeling on guys dressed up in sparkly glitter paint and black clown makeup. Go ahead, man. Kiss were just the juggalos for the 80s, 70s and 80s. If you like Kiss, you basically like the Insane Clown Posse, because they're the same thing. You are a juggalo. So Paul Stanley had made, again, very rational comments. saying that he does not agree that we should be pushing not just for adults to have this ability, but pushing against the concept that we should be normalizing and encouraging children to view themselves, to experiment with these thoughts and concepts that they don't understand in regards to their gender, which I completely agree with. This is the rational point of view. This is the everyday common sense point of view that is being pushed against so hard. They're trying so hard to move the Overton window so that it's not in the topic of conversation anymore, to say that these kids are not old enough to comprehend what they are being taught, what they are being inundated with, what they're being propagandized with. Now, Paul Stanley got a bunch of shit. So D. Snyder said, I think that that's totally fine. Like what Paul Snyder said, and I'll read you the exact thing. Here's what Paul Stanley, a portion of Paul Stanley's post. So he posted a long letter. Here's a portion. This is reported from The Hill. I'll read you his portion and then Snyder's response. So Paul Stanley said, in part, quote, with many children who have no real sense of sexuality or sexual experiences, caught up in the, quote, fun of using pronouns and saying what they identify as, some adults mistakenly confuse teaching acceptance with normalizing and encouraging a situation that has been a struggle for those truly affected and have turned it into a sad and dangerous fad. I agree with that. When you talk about this, and of course he got demonized for saying that it's sad and it's dangerous and that they're, encouraging and normalizing. What's wrong with normalizing trans? This isn't dangerous. Well, it is dangerous. It is dangerous when it comes to children. And this is the argument I get into with my friends when it comes down to this. Living in Los Angeles, obviously, I have a lot of ultra leftist friends. The argument that I get into them is, frankly, when you have children that are identifying as, it goes into the board joke I made last week about assimilating people at a clip, when you've got the percentages skyrocketing of kids that identify as trans, and there was some recent poll that said something like 50% of kids in California now identify as non-gender, non-binary, or trans. This is a fad, and it is dangerous because when you're now talking about the application of hormones, when you're talking about the application or hormonal blockers, when you're talking about potential surgeries for kids that, yes, as young as 13, as young, maybe even younger in some cases, you are talking about sterilization. You are talking about unchangeable alterations to their makeup as a living being, which cannot go back. And there's been somewhat of a scandal now in that these trans activists lie. The people that are talking to these kids, they say, well, you can just go back. You can have a second puberty. You can have whatever and just get back in normal. No, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. So it's very dangerous. Having surgeries that you don't need for a problem that may not be a problem at all, to what Dee Snider's going to say in a minute, that's a major problem. And the fact that these kids are identifying at such a record clip, it used to be 1 in 50,000. Now it's 1 in 50, nationwide. That is not a scientific outcome that makes any sense. It is not a statistical outcome that makes any sense other than this is becoming a social contagion. This is becoming a quote unquote fad. This is becoming a way to get attention. And the downside is that the consequences for that can be very real in a 100% gender affirming care situation like we have now, and which I argued was part of the reason we would have a better society under anarchy, is that you don't have a top down dear colleague letter type situation where they're forcing this down people's throats. So what was Dee Snider's response? He said, you know what? There was a time when I felt pretty too. Glad my parents didn't jump to any rash conclusions. Yeah, to his credit, yes, good to speak out. This is from somebody that's supposedly, the greatest ally to the LGBTQIT community. You dare to go against that orthodoxy and they slap you down. So Dee Snider responds saying that, this is insane. He has a very long response, as you'd have mentioned, but that he's now saying that if you speak out in any way against the orthodoxy, and this is basically what Dee Snider was saying, if you speak out at all against any portion, if you don't agree in lockstep, then you are an enemy to a cause that you've supported for your entire career, which is what he's done. So it says the transgender community needs more moderates to support their choices, even if we don't agree with every one of their edicts. For some transgender people, not all, to accuse supporters like me of transphobia is not a good look for their cause. And let's see, I'm trying to find the other one that he said. It's a long article. But this is showing you, and I've argued this, that the rational aspect is taking over. Some people say, well, it's not rational that we're supporting trans to this extent anyway. And D. Snyder is just drawing the line at this one thing, but there's more. Okay, fine. You can have your opinion on that. But the fact that he's stepping up here, the fact that Paul Stanley's stepping up, we got 80s rockers stepping up, for every one of these people that actually says something, you know there are 1,000 out there that think it, but are too terrified to say it. They're too cowardly to speak up. But hopefully this will spark something. And hopefully the absurdity of removing D. Snyder from the San Francisco Pride Parade, and also the fact that trans is now completely associated with gay and lesbian, pride parades, even though they have virtually no overlap, really, other than many people that are gay that transition to be female and still want to date many people that are straight will transition but still be straight. So, really, they have nothing in common because they are not attracted to the other gender in 99% of the circumstances here. Statistically, many transgender people are still attracted to that same sex. They just change, which is why there's such a battle between trans women and lesbians, because these trans women go to try to pick up lesbians, and lesbians go, I don't want you, you're a dude. But just, anyway, good on D. Snyder for speaking his mind and drawing a line in the sand here. And shame on the media, by the way, because the media response to this, predictably, as I said, is the mafia arm of this movement now. And these people that are pretending to be journalists are simply assassins trying to culturally assassinate anybody that doesn't agree. Recently, Billboard had an article about Paul Stanley, and number one, mislabeled. They said that what Paul Stanley was saying was misinformation, which is going to come back around later in the episode. Misinformation about the trans movement. Number one, it wasn't misinformation. Nothing Paul Stanley said is misinformation. They tried to put a little stickler point in there saying, well, these organizations only recommend transgender surgeries for children after age 18. As if we don't know for a fact that they're happening right now. As if we don't have kids right now in the public eye in lawsuits. And I mentioned previously, there's a girl in a lawsuit against Kaiser Permanente because at age 13, gender affirming care, they went, chopped her tits off, gave her the hormone surgery or hormone therapies and all this. And now the girl realizes, I didn't need any of that. I had depression. I had body issues. I had, whatever else, a couple of different other issues that were undiagnosed, or if they were diagnosed, they just didn't care. She was 13. We have that instance that I told you about where a child was given hormones so young that they couldn't even do a surgery with the child's penis and had to use a piece of the colon, and that child died. These kids aren't 18. So Billboard shamefully tries to accuse Paul Stanley of misinformation while spouting blatant falsities on their own, blatant lies on their own. But then they also call Paul Stanley's claims a part of an ongoing misinformation campaign. Paul Stanley, for giving his opinion on this, is part of an ongoing misinformation campaign. Because remember, guys, the trans activists, they're not running a misinformation campaign or a propaganda campaign, right? They're just doing it for the common good. But if you dare to speak out against it, well, you're part of this nefarious plot, a grand conspiracy to spread misinformation about how we shouldn't chop the fucking genitals off or castrate kids chemically with these different therapies when they're so young and can't understand it. That's the conspiracy, guys. And we're all part of it. If we dare to question the orthodoxy. It's just fucking pathetic. Okay. That's enough on that. Trans rockers versus trans activists, 80s rockers versus trans activists. I know I'm coming down on the side of the 80s rockers. All right, next topic. I'm just going to burn through them. There's a lot of stuff to talk about here. By the way, I'm going to have Lila Hart, comedian, fantastic gal that I met out here in LA, and of course is off and on. She's actually been on a whirlwind media tour. She tours a lot with Chrissy Mayer. I know she was on a lot of shows in The Blaze recently, and they took a trip to Texas. Anyway, comedian Lila Hart is going to join me next week, and we'll do a little live stream on that. I think on Monday we're going to be doing it at something like, I think, 4 p.m. Pacific. Maybe it's 1 p.m. Yeah, 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern live stream. So make sure you go to the Lions of Liberty YouTube or our Twitter. You can catch that live stream. But that should be a fun show. So mark your calendars. Okay, circle back around. Jordan Neely. There's been a lot of instances. We'll talk about Jordan Neely real quick. We'll talk a little bit about this Hispanic neo-Nazi. Actually, I'll just do the Hispanic neo-Nazi right now because I don't have that much to say about it yet. There's still details coming out, some of which are murky. I know that one of the murkier things is that he's apparently a neo-Nazi. They've got photos of him with these, swastika tattoos and all this other stuff. And people are saying, well, is this contrived from the FBI to paint him as a white supremacist, even though he's Hispanic? I don't know. Maybe. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I'm not going to buy into the conspiracy theory that deep, but it's certainly possible. I wouldn't put it past anybody. But it certainly is interesting that anybody that seems to do anything is somehow tied to white supremacy, no matter what. It's just the apology du jour for any race other than white people that gets involved, that clearly they were brainwashed into believing the white supremacist stuff, and he very well might have been. I don't know if that specifically came into play here, and as far as who he was targeting, who he was shooting against. I mean, it was a mall. Was it a black mall? Do they have those? Do we have segregated black malls? Was he only shooting at the blacks only fountains in the mall? Do they have those in Texas? Black only fountains? But I will say that the focus on the racial aspect of it is sickening. I will say that it is interesting, and I joked about this, but I do think it's interesting to see that there are these other races that are subscribing to anti-immigration sentiment. Now, for a long time, by the way, Hispanics and Latinos that have immigrated, as well as other races, have immigrated legitimately, legally, have not been fans of immigration and soft immigration policies on the borders. They are usually the most strident against those because they did it the right way. They had to wait, they had to work, they come in, and then obviously it would piss you off if that was you. But I was joking that it's kind of funny to see if this trend takes off, where all these Latinos start to become white supremacists. Well, the Democrats have really fucked themselves, right? I mean, the irony of importing an entire voter block of Hispanics and then have them all become neo-Nazi white supremacists. That's a whoopsie. Well, that's a whoopsie. Democrats just sitting around going, fuck, man. Who could have seen it coming? Who could have seen it coming? And I don't have much more to add on that. Fuck that guy. Fuck every mass shooter. I don't give a shit what his name was. Next, I want to talk about is Jordan Neely. So Jordan Neely was choked out by a white, we made sure to know about that, a white Marine on the subway. There was one of the most embarrassing articles I've ever seen written in my life in USA Today, which had written a whole article around how his family just says he was such a sweet guy that just wanted to sing, right? And, he was described instead of as a crazy homeless person, which is what he was, is a nutball that harassed people in the subway with multiple incidents on his record and had not performed in the Michael Jackson character for several years, according to many reports. Well, the media portrayed him as a poor musician, performer who was just attacked by this white Marine and choked out. And obviously race had a huge deal to do with it. Now, race in this situation had almost nothing to do with it, I'm sure. And again, we'll see what other videos come out. But from the initial reports from people on the scene, this guy was harassing people. He was being violent. He stole from a person on the subway. And this Marine used his training to basically take him down, stop the incident, and use too much force. Why is race even a component of this? It shouldn't be at all. In any way, shape, or form, it fucking shouldn't be. There also shouldn't be media writing kiss-my-ass articles about this guy, portraying him as a saint. I mean, this very much reminds you of the George Floyd situation, where a guy who was empirically a piece of shit. George Floyd was a piece of shit. Factually. He was violent. He had arrests for assaulting women. He was not a good dude. Really bad guy. Violent break-ins, and just a horrible guy. But he was lionized because of our race-centered media culture and political culture, which has to put this at the forefront in order to keep us divided. That's what it's there for. It's the most convenient thing to keep us from seeing what the bigger issues of the day are, from being infuriated by the war state, by being infuriated by the inflationary state, even though California is trying to make that even worse by approving 1.2 million per black person in California for reparations. That's what the board recommends. 1.2 million for black people in California, a state that has never had racism. Never had slaves here. Sorry, I can't say never had racism. Never had slaves here. No slaves. Never. But they want to pay 1.2 million per black person in California, because that's not going to inflame things, right? That's going to make race relations even worse. Unbelievable. So anyway, Jordan Neely gets choked out. Protests, all these race things. Oh, racism now. Stop the violence. Blah, 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 bullshit. Meanwhile, if you look at any statistical measure of white on black crime, violent white on black crime, it is the tiniest fraction on a yearly basis. The tiniest fraction compared to black on white violence, which is, 65% of all violence out there. But the statistics don't lie in this manner. Yes, I know there are lies, and damn statistical lies. But in this instance, you've got these reports of violent crimes. It's almost infinitesimally small. Virtually never happens. Meanwhile, you can find instances every single day of black on white assault, but the media doesn't go out of its way to lionize any of the, little white girls you see getting beaten up by mobs of black kids on TikTok every day. It doesn't go out of its way to lionize any white victims. It didn't go out of its way to lionize any of the Christians that were mowed down by a gunman recently, the trans gunman. Where was the puff piece about the moms or the teachers or the children talking about what they wanted to do in USA Today, how their lives had been cut short? Where were those pieces? They weren't there. And meanwhile, within one day of a crazed, homeless, former Michael Jackson Subway impersonator being choked out, and by the way, who among us hasn't wanted to choke out virtually every Subway performer, regardless of whether they're violent or not? I know I do. They're obnoxious and horrible and usually highly aggressive. I mean, the fact that they turn this article around shows you exactly where things are at. It doesn't matter the context. It doesn't matter who the person is. It's just a matter of their skin. If they're black, they will be portrayed as a saint. If they're white, they'll be portrayed as a villain. That's the media culture we live in today, and it's fucking disgusting. Now, circling back a little bit here, talking about the media reaction, talking about how now there's these protests, right? People were blocking the subway, which again, doesn't hurt. You're not fighting back against Whitey by standing and blocking the subway platform. You're just being a fucking asshole. It reminds me of the climate protesters, these oil assholes who also block the subway lines. But it's just fascinating to see the way in which all of these stories have been warped recently to focus on race. And I saw some, media survey that showcased that, the attention on race has skyrocketed over the past 10 years for 700% or 1,000% as far as media coverage, just on these racial issues. Because it shouldn't matter. This is one guy, one man in a subway altercation in New York City in a subway car. Guy gets choked out. Guy gets choked out by another man, dies. That's not a national news story, especially not in New York City where the subways are so violent. But what's interesting is not only the focus on race in this, but the apologizing and the complete and blatant lying that's being done by some people. Like there was a woman on Twitter I was following. Actually, I wasn't following her. Somebody retweeted it. But somebody had posted the, again, very obvious comment that you should be able to, in a polite society, right? Quote unquote, polite society, a high trust society, which we do not have here, obviously. You should be able to ride the subway and be generally confident that you're not going to be assaulted, that there won't be homeless psychopaths all over the subways. And I saw a very disturbing video of a black, homeless crackhead psychopath sitting down on a subway next to a lady. And she tries to get up and I don't even know if it's a he or she, I can't even tell, grabs her hair and is holding her down on the bench by her fucking hair. And not one of the little pussies on that fucking train got up to help her. And as she's literally mouthing, "Help me." Sickening. That's another aspect of society is people talk about toxic masculinity, though it's this horrible thing. How dare you be toxically masculine? How dare you try to, you're not a white knight. And by the way, you can be any color knight. I don't care what color knight you want to be, but be a fucking knight. There's no way I would have not helped that woman. There's no fucking way. She's sitting there with this goddamn skinny crackhead grabbing her fucking hair. You're not going to try to help this person? Anyway, after these incidents come out, this Jordan Neely thing, and any number, you can find a million internet videos of psychotic people on subways and light rail. This woman writes for like New York Magazine, wank wank, posts that she's a 23-year veteran of New York City. I've lived here 23 years. I've never once. And of course, she was responding to somebody saying, be accosted by a half-naked person on a subway. So what does she says? I've never been accosted by a half-naked person on a subway. Now, she's either being just an obfuscating, nitpicky cunt and saying that she just has never experienced a half-naked person. I should have said the C word. That's going to knock down our views on YouTube. Whatever. She's never seen a half-naked person. Either she's intentionally using that phrase, because she even said it again, to lie, right? To say, well, I've never seen a half-naked person. It's like, okay, you've never seen a pirate with a peg leg in real life, but you've seen people that are on boats, right? You've seen people get off boats before, but you've never seen an actual sea pirate get off with a peg leg in the New York harbor. Very different things. But if somebody said, hey, I see a lot of people get off the boat, you're not going to be like, I didn't see a lot of people get off the boat because, the boats don't exist. She's basically saying the boats don't exist. She's saying that she's 23 years, never encountered any sort of violence. Bullshit. Bullshit. If you go to visit New York City and ride the subway more than once, and even probably going once, you're highly likely to encounter one of these homeless subway psychopaths or, performing artists or whatever they might be. Most of the time, though, it's just homeless weirdos that are, drugged out, that are drunk, passed out, that are just crazy. I mean, my sister lives in New York City. She lives in Queens. I've gone probably 20 times in my life. Half those times I've been with a crazy person on the subway easily. So it's just like the lies. And it's like, are you living, is this the reality? And this is why I often say we're in a post-factual world, because the evidence is so overwhelming. And it's on video because everybody's got their phones now. The overwhelming preponderance of evidence is so in the favor of the reality here that these people have to quite literally create a new world within their own heads where these things aren't happening. And then lie about it at the top of their lungs and on social media to convince others that their worldview somehow has any semblance to the actual reality that surrounds them. And it is a phenomenon that I think is tied so deeply into social media and being right? Because you put your stake down, right? You put your spear down in the dirt, and then you will not move that spear no matter what. Even if you are provably wrong, if it's right in front of your fucking face, you still will say, well, that's something different. There's reasons for that. Well, okay. Well, yes, there's violence, but you see, there's violence because of systematic racism, right? There's always going to be an excuse for you never to move that spear, which is why I have focused and continue to focus, not this episode, but we'll continue to focus on creating a new system of belief and inspiration, because arguing pure facts doesn't seem to do anything anymore. There's got to be something more. It has to be something that you can believe in with a religious fervor. It has to be the castle on the hill, the white shining city on the hill that you believe in, that you're trying to work towards, because simply telling people what you're talking about here is bullshit does not work. Bounces right off the armor. Okay. Next thing, I want to play a little clip for you here, and then we will wrap up. I'm going to play this clip of Richard Dreyfuss talking about Oscars diversity quotas, and then we'll do a little bit on E-Verify. That's going to be very short. Basically, Thomas Massey has completely nailed it. It's completely correct. And then we'll wrap up with just the Bud Light CEO being a doofus who just doesn't get it. The dude just don't get it, man. So here's Richard. Let me play this for you, and then we'll circle back.
Starting in 2024, films will be required to meet new inclusion standards to be eligible for the Academy Awards for Best Picture. They'll have to have a certain percentage of actors or crew from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. What do you think of these new inclusion standards for films?
They make me vomit.
Why?
Because this is an art form, it's also a form of commerce, and it makes money, but it's an art. And no one should be telling me as an artist that I have to give in to the latest, most current idea of what morality is. And what are we risking? Are we really risking hurting people's feelings? You can't legislate that. And you have to let life be life. And I'm sorry, I don't think that there's a minority or a majority in the country that has to be catered to like that. Yeah. You know, Laurence Olivier was the last white actor to play Othello. And he did it in 1965. And he did it in blackface. And he played a black man brilliantly. Am I being told that I will never have a chance to play a black man? Is someone else being told that if they're not Jewish, they shouldn't play The Merchant of Venice? Mm-hmm. Are we crazy?
Okay, so there you go. There's more to that interview, which was on PBS, but you could see where he's coming from, right? And he makes a good point that art is art. Now, if we're being told that, there's so many works of art and different artist types out there that are, of course, propped up by the government and by government stipends, which will call everybody racist and challenge all these different, norms, patriarchal norms, gender norms. It is pretty funny that when it comes to film as an art form, we are being told that we have to follow these very strident rules in the process. Otherwise, it will not be considered for the accolades of the industry. I mean, that is a pretty funny little thing. Now, he's talking about, will he ever get to play a black man? Well, Richard, probably not. Probably not anymore. Not anymore. But to his point about playing, The Merchant of Venice, you have to be Jewish. I thought it was interesting, you would have straight actors playing gay people in the past, and now that never happens. And of course, you had many gay actors that hadn't come out of the closet playing straight actors. And now I guess that's a little bit more accepted. But there's a point that Richard doesn't mention here. He makes a lot of good points. But one thing he does not mention here is a point that I had made when this first got floated out, whatever it was, a year ago, a year and a half ago. Which is when you're talking about film, you're talking about works of art. And in theory, the Oscars take all works of art into account, whether or not they should be nominated for an award. Now, there's certain rules, it has to go into the actual theaters for a certain period of time, which is something like 2 weeks to be considered. I know this from, working on campaigns for clients before. One was like a music campaign. But you have to be in the theater for a certain amount of time to be considered, and there's a few different rules, but none of which touched upon the number of actors you had to have that were gay or black or, minority, whatever they might be called. I don't know. It had to be from a native tribe or have to touch on a underrepresented community, right? Which is another one of these fucking requirements. I have to tell the stories of the these protected classes. It was simply, if you made a good movie and everybody agreed it was a good movie, then you won an award. Great. But the problem is with these new recommendations, or I say requirements, you're going into an era where, just like with every other regulation, basically, and this is why I'm sure the big studios are huge proponents of these new rules, well, who does it really fuck? It doesn't fuck the big studios. I mean, it fucks them in the way that people aren't going to want to see these stupid dog shit movies, and that can be proven by the last round of Oscars where Till, as I talked about, one of those films where I shook my head and said, who's going to want to see this? Get yet another story about, oppressed black woman whose son was lynched, and now she's a woman standing up for the rights. Okay, we've seen and heard these stories a million times. You make 50 of them every year to keep us angry at each other. We get it. Nobody wants to see it. And it failed miserably at the box office, yet still was talked about as an Oscar contender. So the big studios can afford to create these films, whether as throwaways or they can afford more specifically to do a massive search to fly in actors and pay actors to meet the diversity quotas. They can fly in the crew members to meet the diversity quotas as far as, I don't know, having 20% black people and 15% Asian people and 12% Native American people, whatever it might be that the Oscars is doing. They can afford to do that. They can meet those requirements because they have the money, they have the staff, they have the time, they have all the things you need to check all the boxes. So great for them. Now they have essentially eliminated competition from smaller filmmakers. Because if you happen to be an independent filmmaker, if you happen to be a filmmaker based in Korea, and remember, Parasite won Korean film, all Korean cast, no black people, no white people, no Native American people, no Indian people, just Koreans. Are they going to be forced to have these diversity quotas included? Because if so, guess who wins again? The domestic studios, because now they don't have to compete with the big Korean studios or the Chinese studios or the Japanese studios or everything. We're in these homogenous environments, or Swedish films for that matter. Like a Swedish films now, they've got their, their refugee rape gangs in there. At least one of those people has to be an actor. But the point is, they've eliminated quite a bit of competition. And the smaller filmmaker that is based in a small town that doesn't have a budget and wants to make a film for, let's say, at a high budget would be $2 million, right? Doesn't have the budget to click all the boxes, to fly in a black cameraman and a lesbian Eskimo sound girl and have a lead that identifies as Native American, like Elizabeth Warren. Maybe he's making the Elizabeth Warren story. That filmmaker is now on the short end of the stick because they can't compete to meet all of these quotas. It's just like any other industry, as I said, any other regulation. And this is why I was arguing that under, again, anarchy, right? It is the absence of rulers. The Motion Picture Academy of Sciences, right, who oversees the Oscars, they are the rulers here. And they are fucking definitively the small filmmaker by pushing in these regulations, just like every other regulation from every other group. They're always to the benefit of those in power. Anything having to do with banking, anything having to do with social media, anything having to do with housing, anything having to do with any industry ever. All the rules that are created benefit those in power at the detriment to the people that are trying to come up and do something new or interesting and compete with them. Always has been, always will be. So fuck this idiotic, well, it's going to make for worse movies. It's going to make for less competition. And frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if it spawned a counter award show that probably is going to have more interesting things in it. Okay. So last item, second to last item. Well, not too bad on time here. So E-Verify. This will be short. E-Verify is a maneuver by the GOP or led by the GOP to try to combat the hiring of illegal aliens in the United States. Essentially, the concept is that you would have an e-verification system in the U.S. so that companies that would hire illegal aliens that would come in over the border, they would be punished for hiring them. Basically, the argument is that this system, which would be based on multiple forms of ID, verifiable ID, probably a fingerprint, probably social security or driver's license, whatever it might be, multiple forms of ID that are hard to get if you're illegal, those would be required for anybody to be hired in the United States. So while I guess, it would fight against some people getting hired, the argument, and Thomas Massey nails this argument perfectly, is twofold. Number one, this would create yet another surveillance state over the entire employment bureau or industry, because every single time you hire anybody, you now have to run it through the federal government, right? So that's infringing on you as a business owner, hiring who you want, doing, now you have to go through a different layer of bureaucracy. Now, additionally, as a citizen, you have to have additional layers of identification on file that have to be verifiable whenever you want to change jobs or get a new job. It's going to make, by the way, it's going to make the hiring process vastly more expensive. We're adding an entire new layer of massive bureaucracy on. So add that to the budget line item. And as we know, anytime this power exists, it always gets pushed out further and further and made larger and larger. So once it gets in there, it's not going to leave. And Massey's called this the new Patriot Act. I would agree with him because there's another component to this too, which is the central bank digital currencies. Said it right, I think. somebody was tweeting at me that I always fuck up the CBDCs, and I do every time. Every time I go to say it, I think the right one, and then I say the wrong one. Because I correct myself saying, oh, I always say this wrong, and I default to the other one. So CBDCs, Thomas Massey makes the excellent point that for this to be effective, for this to actually stop people from hiring illegals in mass, well, you also have to go with a cashless society. Because how are most illegals paid anyway? Under the table with cash or check. So you have to have a cashless society wherein every transaction is traceable by the US government and has to be verified that now if you're employing this person and they can track who you're sending money to, and famously the government got slapped down by the public for trying to make every Venmo transaction over $600 traceable and thus opening up your bank account to all sorts of government intrusion. They would make that exact same thing, but for a lower amount. I'm guessing $100 to $200. Because again, you cannot have a system that combats illegal hiring without eliminating cash. Or if it's not going to be cash only, right? Okay, well then, again, the Venmo. You have to make sure that that Venmo has to be watched, has to be traced, has to be seen as not being able to circumvent the system of surveillance that the United States has put into place. So Massey's been fantastic on this issue, calling it out for what it is. He's been, one of several that have stood up and said no to this on the Republican side. I'm hoping that it gets struck down. It's interesting to see some people like Jack Posobiec touting this legislation, who I'm sure he would go on record as fighting against surveillance and all this other shit, but doesn't see the danger in this. Doesn't see that, like most government legislations, this is a Trojan horse for something far more nefarious. And I always talk about how the left Trojan horses all these different things in. Well, the right does it too. And this is the right Trojan horsing in a new level of surveillance and digital currencies under the guise of protecting our gerbs. So, good job, Massey. All right, last thing. Shorter show, which is good for me. As I said, I'm still a little under the weather. So, Bud Light, I called it, by the way, another terrible week. Sales down another 20%. And I told you that it would continue to get worse. And I told you that the boycott was not going to be a flash in the pan 1 week thing. It was going to continue to get worse. And Bud Light's idiotic public relations approach to this, which is just mind boggling to the highest degree. From the initial decision to do it was unbelievably stupid, to the fact they didn't immediately fire the marketing person and just foist all the blame on them was insanely stupid. To the non-apology letter that they put out, which didn't even really acknowledge that they had done anything to piss their customers off or acknowledge the insults made by the marketing director who's now on leave, was unbelievably insincere. I mean, people generated an AI version of the apology letter from the CEO, which actually read better than the one they put out. To the latest iteration, which is Bud Light CEO saying that the entire response around the Dylan Mulvaney saga here, where Bud Light, to recap very briefly, unbelievably stupidly, sent cans with Dylan Mulvaney's face to him, her, whatever you want to call it. I'll call her, I guess. Sent her cans with her face all over it and paid her many thousands of dollars to do a promotional Bud Light, look at me pretending to be a lady and insulting all womanhood in my bathtub with my Bud Light, right? The most predictable outcome to a campaign I've ever seen in my life. Literally, one person on the right had to see this for it to go viral, which is exactly what happened. And then for Bud Light to be like, "Oh my God, I can't believe this," which is what they're doing. They're saying, "Well, it wasn't a campaign; it was just a post. A couple of posts we paid him to do, as though this isn't part of an overall marketing campaign." And that's not the issue, which is what they don't get, right? So the CEO most recently saying, "Well, it's misinformation that caused this boycott." No, dipshit. No. Who is advising you to say this dumb fuck stuff? Number one, saying that it's misinformation to your core audience, by the way, many of whom see that the things that they didn't like, aka their posts on Facebook or Twitter, calling their information misinformation if they dare to push back against, say, the vaccine, or children having to wear masks, or anybody having to wear masks, or critical race theory, or any of the other things that the left label misinformation, or the government fucking labels misinformation, right? Which now encompasses everything from extremism to hate speech to COVID to education matters to Ukraine. Misinformation. This fucking dipshit goes out there and says it's misinformation that has caused the boycott, triggering his entire base, 100% triggering his entire base, and on top of that, still not acknowledging the core issue, which is that Bud Light stood with this Dylan Mulvaney character, who is the fucking face of this transgender insanity, the more ridiculous pop culture transgenderism insanity movement that many people find not only offensive, but dangerous to their children. Because Mulvaney is social media influencing, he's on TikTok or she's on TikTok and all these other social platforms, which is where young people go to get their content. So they view Dylan Mulvaney as the face of a movement that has gotten way too big, way too fast, with zero brake pumps to slow down what is happening and its impact on children. Bud Light doesn't get it. It's just misinformation, guys. It's not that we aligned ourselves with this particular character who is such a fucking divisive figure in culture with the most predictable outcome. It's all misinformation. All right, well, I hope you've been very misinformed in this show, guys. Thank you for listening. Remember, if you like the show, please subscribe, hit the notify button so you actually see it, because surely this will be shadow banned a little bit for my usage of certain key phrases. And remember, we're on Rumble as well. Follow us on there. We're on Odyssey. And of course, anywhere you are listening to podcasts, please tune in to that. Also, if you're itching to hear me talk about some stuff earlier, I am routinely now on Tuesday night, our time, on the Chris Smith Show over at TNT Radio. So check that out. I've talked for about 20 minutes there at 9:20 Pacific. So it's a little bit late for you East Coasters, but check it out. And of course, it comes out on a podcast as well. All right, guys, that's it from me, Brian McWilliams from the Lions of Liberty Network, and from Mean Age Daydream. Keep those electric eyes on me, babe, and keep that ray gun to my head.